David Spencer, who himself is a former Met Police officer, he was in fact a Detective Chief Inspector, had an article published in the Daily Telegraph last week, headlined "The Police Don't Understand the Law." And of course, if they don't understand the law, then they can't uphold it either. How can you uphold something you don't understand? David Spencer is now the head of crime and justice at the Policy Exchange think tank. He was one of the co-authors of the latest Policy Exchange report titled "Might is Right," which was an in-depth look into policing protests by the UK police, and it recommended guidelines on policing protests to the government. I made a previous video about that report. If you haven't seen it, I recommend you watch it. In the Daily Telegraph article, David Spencer writes, "Any right to protest is actually strictly qualified by restrictions in the interests of national security or public safety, for the prevention of disorder and crime, and for the protection of the rights of others." And that is what the police keeps ignoring. As far back as 2021, an inspection into the policing of protesters by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services said the police do not strike the right balance on every occasion. The balance, more often than not, tips in favour of protesters when the police do not accurately assess the level of disruption and intimidation they cause to the public. And it seems nothing much has changed over the last 3 years since that report. The police seem to think the right to protest reigns supreme to the disruption, inconvenience and intimidation it causes to the public. One example mentioned in the article is a protest by members and supporters of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is now finally banned in the UK, who were calling for a jihad last year at a protest in central London. Surprisingly, and maybe not so surprisingly, the Met Police made no arrests, despite the call for jihad by such a radical group was committing offence under Section 1 of the Terrorism Act 2006, which prohibits statements directly or indirectly encouraging acts of terrorism. The Met Police attempted to explain their lack of action by saying that was based on the advice given to them by their lawyers and advisors. And here is the root cause of the problem. For the sake of inclusivity, all sorts of unsuitable characters have been appointed as advisors to the police. Few such examples have been leaked in the press. We've had the case of lawyer Atiq Malik, who was the head of the Strategic Advisory Board to the Met Police, and it was said in the article that he'd come up with the "from the river to the sea" chant. That leak in the Daily Telegraph was after the publication had revealed Mohammed Kosbar, a prominent chairman at a mosque, had praised the founder of Hamas, and yet he'd been advising the Crown Prosecution Service as part of the security panel on hate crime. I mean, you wonder, can you get a more hate group than Hamas? And we've had the case of the Daily Mail, who published an article on Amina Ahmed. At the time, she described herself on her LinkedIn page as a leadership program facilitator and project manager at the Met Police, and yet she seemingly made calls for those who support Israel to be investigated for a hate crime. She has resigned after that article was published, citing on her LinkedIn that her resignation was because of discrimination against her. You may be interested to know that she was in her position with the Met Police for 15 years. So do you see where the root cause of the problem is? Once again, it goes back to lack of vetting for the sake of political correctness and inclusiveness. If you like the content I put up on YouTube, there are various ways in which you can support the work I do, and with your help we can grow this channel and make more content.